Look at the image. That is not just a piece of metal lying in the dirt. That is a winning lottery ticket. That is $1 billion of R&D budget delivered via airmail, courtesy of a panicked pilot and a foolish adversary. You are looking at a PL-15E, the game changer, the AWACS killer, the missile that Chinese propaganda convinced the world was the ultimate apex predator of the skies. For years we heard the noise. They told us this weapon made our entire air force obsolete. They told Pakistan this tube of explosives guaranteed air dominance. But physics doesn't care about marketing brochures. Treat this as a fictional story that ends with a single terrifying realization for our adversaries. During the recent engagement, which we will call the incident for the sake of diplomatic niceties, a Pakistani J-10 pilot found himself locked up by an Indian Rafale. The panic set in. He didn't have the position, he didn't have the energy, but he had the brochure stats. He had a weapon his Chinese suppliers promised could kill from 135 kilometers away. So he pulled the trigger. He fired blindly into the gray zone, well outside the dynamic launch envelope, praying the missile's legendary dual pulse motor would perform a miracle. It didn't. The missile burned hot, exhausted its first pulse, coasted, ignited its second pulse, and then nothing. It ran out of kinetic energy miles short of the target. It didn't detonate. It didn't self destruct. It just fell. It became a lawn dart. It tumbled out of the sky and slammed into the soft earth of a border field, skipping like a stone and coming to rest intact. This is where the story shifts from a tactical failure to a strategic catastrophe for our enemies. Standard operating procedure for a lost advanced weapon is immediate airstrikes to sanitize the crash site. You bomb the wreck until it's dust. But the adversary was in disarray. Their communications were jammed. They didn't know where it landed. We did. Within minutes of the crash, Indian assets were moving. This wasn't a standard recovery. This was a snatch and grab of the highest order. Special response teams secured the perimeter before the dust had settled. They didn't just throw a tarp over it, they brought in the hazmat containment units. They treated that unexploded ordnance like a biological specimen. They loaded it onto a heavy lift chopper and flew it directly to the DRDO missile complex in Hyderabad. The enemy realized their mistake 4 hours later. By then, the PL-15 was already under the X-ray scanners. They had handed us the blueprint to their air superiority. The engineers at DRDO didn't care about the radar seeker. We have ASS seekers. We know how they work. They didn't care about the guidance software. What they wanted to know was the range. How was China claiming 200 kilometers on a missile that size? The geometry didn't make sense. The volume wasn't there, so they opened the motor casing, and that's when the room went silent. It wasn't the motor design, it was the fuel. The DRDO scientists realized this is not invented by Chinese but copied from Americans and improved upon it. How did they get their hands on Amram fuel? Which Chinese friendly country has American Amrams? Any guess? Do comment below. For decades, solid rocket motors have relied on HTPB, hydroxyl terninated polybutadiene. It's the standard binder, it works, but it has a ceiling. You can only pack so much energy into the chemical bonds. We assumed the Chinese were using the same chemistry, maybe with slightly better grain geometry. We were wrong. The chemical analysis of the PL-15's propellant grain revealed a composition that shouldn't have been stable. It was a high-density, high-energy composite modified with a stabilized Cl-20 derivative. Cl-20 is the holy grail of energetic materials. It is significantly more powerful than HMX or RDX. The problem has always been sensitivity. It explodes if you look at it wrong. Manufacturing it on a mass scale for missile fuel is a nightmare. If you get the mixture wrong, the factory disappears. But the Chinese had cracked it. They had found a bonding agent, a specific polymer matrix that stabilized the Cl-20 crystals, allowing them to pack 40% more chemical energy into the same volume of fuel. This was the secret. This was why the PL-15 could fly. It wasn't aerodynamics, it was brute force chemistry. They had a fuel that burned hotter, faster and longer than anything in the NATO or Russian inventory. The order came down from the top, copy it. Now, this is where the genius of our scientists comes into play. We didn't just copy it, we understood it. In 6 months, 6 frantic, sleepless months, DRDO chemists deconstructed the molecular lattice of that fuel. They identified the stabilizer. They synthesized the binder. They replicated the casting process. We called the new mixture Agniplex. The test batches were terrifying. The burn rate was off the charts. The specific impulse, the efficiency of the rocket jumped by double digit percentages. Now, here is the beautiful part. The fiction you are being told is that missile development takes 10 years. That is true when you are designing a new airframe, wind tunnel testing, and writing flight control laws. But we didn't need a new airframe. We had the Astra. The Astra Mach 1 is a solid missile, good aerodynamics, good seeker, but limited by its fuel. It carries a standard HTP big grain. Its max range is 110 kilometers. That is respectable, but it's not world leading. The engineers asked a simple question. What happens if we pour this Chinese CL-20 slurry into the existing Astra Mach 1 motor casing? Computer simulations said the casing would rupture from the pressure, so they reinforced the thermal lining. They adjusted the nozzle throat geometry by a few millimeters to handle the increased mass flow, and then they fired it. The telemetry data from the Chandipur test range was initially dismissed as a sensor error. The Astra Mach 1, mechanically identical to the old version aside from the fuel, didn't stop at 110 kilometers. It didn't stop at 120. It screamed through the sky, riding a column of blue-white fire that burned with a ferocity we had never seen. It hit 160 kilometers. Do you understand what that means? Without redesigning the missile, without changing the launchers on the Su-30, without retraining the pilots, we instantly increased the kill zone of the Indian Air Force by 50%. A 50% increase in range just by changing the gas in the tank. This is the impossible range extension the media is whispering about. It's not magic, it's high density chemistry, but they didn't stop there. The Astra Mach 2 was already in development. It was designed for a dual pulse motor to hit 200 kilometers. It was a large missile built to carry more fuel. When they loaded the Agniplex mixture into the Mach 2 dual pulse motor, the results were even more dramatic. The first pulse accelerated the missile to Mach 5.5 in seconds. The sustained burn was incredibly efficient. When the second pulse kicked in during the terminal phase, the missile had so much energy left that it was still accelerating at 240 kilometers. That puts the Astra Mach 2 in a league of its own. It outranges the AMRAAM D, it outranges the Meteor, and ironically, it outranges the very PL-15 that birthed it. The adversary assumed that by selling the PL-15 to Pakistan, they were creating a balance of power. They thought they were giving their proxy a stick big enough to keep the Indian Air Force at bay. Instead, they handed us the technology to break the stick over their heads. This is the fruit of war. This is the penalty of incompetence. If that pilot had held his fire or if the missile had self-destructed properly, we would still be 5 years behind in propellant technology. We would still be struggling to stabilize CL-20. Because of that one dud, the timeline has collapsed. The Indian Air Force is now inducting the Astra Mach 1 extended range quietly. They aren't announcing it on the evening news, they are simply swapping out the crates in the bunkers. A Pakistani pilot taking off tomorrow thinks he knows the safe distance. He thinks if he stays 120 kilometers away, he is safe from the Astra. He is dead wrong. He will be flying into a kill box that he believes is empty space. The element of surprise is absolute. And this brings us to the future, the Gandiv. This is the final nail in the coffin. The Astra Mach 3 was supposed to be a solid fuel ducted ramjet SFDR missile with a 300-kilometer range. That was the target. But SFDR engines rely on a gas generator to feed the ramjet combustor. The efficiency of that gas generator defines the range. With the new fuel chemistry, the gas generator on the Gandiv is operating at efficiencies that defy previous models. The burn is cleaner, hotter, and denser. The ramjet can sustain Mach 4.5 cruise for longer periods. The updated simulations for the Gandiv are now confirming a maximum engagement range of 340 kilometers. That is not an air-to-air missile anymore. That is a sniper rifle for taking out AWACS and refueling tankers deep inside enemy airspace. We can launch from our side of the border and kill a support aircraft loitering over Lahore or Tibet. We can blind their radar coverage before our fighters even cross the line of control. The Gandiv effectively denies the enemy the use of their own airspace. It forces their force multipliers, the eyes and ears of their air defense, to retreat so far back that they become useless. The irony is palpable. The Chinese pride themselves on stealing technology. They copied the Russians. They hacked the Americans. They built an empire on reverse engineering. And now the tables have turned. We stripped their crown jewel. We improved it. We weaponized it. And now we are pointing it back at them. The PL-15 in the dirt was a warning. Not of their strength, but of their hubris. They trusted their marketing. They trusted their proxy. They got sloppy. In the high-stakes game of air dominance, you cannot afford to be sloppy. You cannot afford to give your enemy a free look at your hand. Because if you do, you might just find that your enemy learns faster than you do. The skies over the subcontinent have changed, the ranges have expanded, the red lines have moved, and the fuel that powers this new dominance? It was made in China, refined in India, and it is ready to burn. The Astra is no longer just a missile, it is a statement that says, thank you for the gift. Now, watch what we do with it. This is the story of the dud in the dirt. This is the story of how the PL 15 died so the Gandiv could rise. And it is a story that ends with a single terrifying realization for our adversaries. We know your secrets, and we have made them our own.